Hi there folks, this is Kevin McNamara, founder of Grief to Inspiration and motherswhohavelostachild.com. I'd like to welcome you to my Grief to Inspiration audio series called People Who Inspire. And my very special guest today is from Whitesboro in New York, over in the US. He's an addictions counsellor and clinical supervisor, as well as an adjunct professor in psychology and psychology child life at Utica College in New York, as well as many other things. And he's also the founder of bootsyandangel.com, which we'll talk about shortly. I'd like to welcome Dave Roberts. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you, Kev. Thanks for having me on the show.
It's a pleasure to be talking to you, and thank you for giving us your time today. You're over there in New York, and we're here on the Gold Coast in Australia, so it's pretty amazing what technology can do these days.
Oh yeah, it's like you're right in my living room.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, it's great.
Yeah, you're right. It's like I'm talking to you right in my living room. It's great.
Okay, Dave, for people who don't know you, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, your upbringing and your family?
First of all, I'm 56 years old, born and raised in the Utica, and I've lived there for the last 30 years of my life. Counselor 27 years in the psych and psych child life departments at Utica College. And among other things, I'm a contributing writer for the Open to Hope Foundation. I've written articles for other self-improvement and grief publications, and I presented workshops nationally for the Compassionate Friends of the Bereaved Parents of the USA. And on a personal note, I'm an only child. I was raised exclusively by my mother since the age of 5 years old. My father left at that time, without a word. He just left. I never heard from him again. So it was basically me and my mother. I've been married for 29 years to my beautiful wife, Sherry. I have had a blessed marriage with 3 beautiful children. My son, Dan, is 29 years old. My son, Matt, is 23 years old. And, of course, my daughter, Janine, is forever 18 years old. And so that's an overview of me personally and professionally, Kevin.
Great. Thank you, Dave. And as you know, this audio series, it's all about grief to inspiration, and you're a perfect example of that. You lost your daughter Janine when she was 18 years of age to a very rare form of cancer. Do you mind telling me about that period in your life there?
Not at all. Anything that talks about my daughter Janine, I'll talk to you all day, and anybody who asks me. But she was diagnosed with a very rare form of cancer. It was a connective muscle tissue sarcoma called Avelia rhabdomyosarcoma. And she was diagnosed on May 26, 2012, approximately 24 days after giving birth to her daughter and my only grandchild, Brianna. We went to the Dana-Farber Institute in Boston, which for a consult in June of 2012. And they were one of the best pediatric oncology units in the country, maybe perhaps the world, and particularly with pediatric sarcomas. They said she had a stage 4 tumor, and essentially there was no cure for her cancer. The only hope was aggressive chemotherapy to put it in remission until they could find a cure. So for all intents and purposes, we were told at the time of the consultation that time was going to be a precious commodity. And I kind of figured, Kev, I was going to join a club that none of us as parents ever want to join. Yep. And from 10 months after she was diagnosed on March 1st, 2003, she died with hospice care at our house. She had undergone 6 very aggressive rounds of chemotherapy, which only put her cancer in about 80% remission. And her cancer again just remetastasized, and we brought in hospice services, and she died at home at 18. Our granddaughter and her significant other stayed with us for 4 years after Janine died. They have since moved on, but Brianna is still very much a part of our lives. We see her, regularly, and she's very much her mother's daughter in spirit and particularly in personality. So, and as far as that period of my life, it was a very excruciatingly difficult period of time for me. I had gone from the joys of being a grandfather to the absolute horror of having a child diagnosed with terminal cancer. And I went through the grieving process, I think, on 2 levels. One was when she was actually alive. I watched cancer rob her of her spirit, of her physical body, And I grieved what cancer took from all of us at that point, physically and spiritually from her. And obviously, my grief intensified for many years after she died. Um, it was a life-changing event for me to say the least, and with a lot of peaks and a lot of ups and downs, mostly downs in the beginning. So.
Yeah, right. Gee. You've done it tougher, right, Dave? There's no doubt about that, mate. So tell me a little bit about Janine. What sort of daughter was she?
Oh God! Well, first of all, I don't know if you could see it, but here's her picture.
I can. It's beautiful, mate.
Yep,
Beautiful
she's
picture.
yeah, she's a. First of all, she was just beautiful in every way. She had a smile. She just loved life, plain and simple. She had a smile that light up the city black. And let me tell you, Kev, she could get anything she wanted out of me. All she had to do was flash a smile. She got anything out of me. I mean, I melted. It's like she'd smile and, yeah, okay, I'll give you what you need. She was passionate about the people she loved and the things that she cared about. She collected Tiggers, and that was her favorite Winnie the Pooh character was Tigger. And I had asked Sherry, I said, what was so special, my wife Sherry, I said, what was so special about Tigger? She said, well, she loved Tigger because Tigger bounced, and Tigger was the only one. And I think today, one of the lessons that Janine has taught me is that our kids are all Tiggers. All of our kids who have crossed over are all Tiggers. They are special, they bounce, and they're the only ones in our eyes. So we have a collection of Tiggers, Kev, who are on Earth and who have crossed over. She taught me also that conventional wisdom was highly overrated, and that was just one of the many things I love about her. But Janine remains my greatest teacher today. She has taught me, she's opened me up to the wonders of life, the purity of relationships, that relationships can transcend not only the physical body, but spiritual being. And she basically has helped me transition, and she's going to be forever for me a partner in a life that I really didn't want to lead, but that I'm destined to lead. But she's going to be forever be my partner, and she's walking the walk with me. She becomes a part of everything that I do, personally and professionally.
Fantastic, which is something that I teach also about my daughter. And if people aren't inspired by what you just said then, Dave, then you can't inspire people. That was just fantastic. So I'm sure people listening will be very inspired by those words. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
How did your experience with grief affect your relationships with family, with friends? Did you lose any friends or family at that time? I know certainly with myself, it's very strange the way some people react.
Yeah, and it is. And for me, relationships changed on a whole different level anyway, because the world became a very foreign and terrifying place for me. I didn't know where I fit in. My relationships with myself was different. Everything that I stood for, my values, my beliefs, my priorities, all came into question. At 47 years old, I was learning how to walk all over again. And it was a very, very different feeling for me. So from that perspective, my relationships changed because I was going through a metamorphosis of my own because of my daughter's illness and her death. As far as losing friends, honestly, I didn't lose really a lot of friends. If anything, I gained more friends, Kev.
Yep.
I mobilized a lot of support when Janine was sick because I knew I was going to need it. Given her prognosis, given what we were facing, I really mobilized a lot of support at that time, and it grew. If anything, I lost family, and that was more so of my mother's extended family. And the relationship is kind of at this point beyond repair, but it's something I've learned to live with, and I just celebrate now the people who I have in my life, and there are many, many, many that are guiding me at the point, and that I'm grateful for to have in my life. And the other thing that also helped was my wife and my boys. They helped me gradually. They supported me in my effort to learn to walk again in a world that was totally different, and eventually find a new normal. So I've been fortunate, and I still have a lot of great support today from my friends and family. So I'm fortunate, and my immediate family. So I'm fortunate.
Yeah, no, that's great. Okay, Dave. People often feel a sense of guilt when they lose a child. They have all these thoughts going through their head, that kind of thing. And did you ever experience that kind of thing? I know I certainly had some when Holly died, and it seems to be a fairly common thing that people have this guilt for a while there, and they work their way through it, most people. But did that affect you at all?
Yeah, and I think for me as a father, one of the biggest burdens of guilt I carried was the feeling that I didn't do enough to prevent my daughter's disease. I didn't do enough to save her from her disease, and that wrecked me. I was guilt wracked for well over 2 years, Kev, as a result of that. Um, I kept thinking, oh, maybe I could have convinced her to do an experimental trial. But maybe I could have convinced her to try one more experimental treatment. But the bottom line is she wanted to do her treatment at home. She wanted to treat her disease on her terms. She lived on her terms and she died on her terms. And if anything, what Janine's death taught me is the need for self-determination and self-will, and the power of that. I mean, she lived her life on her terms, and she died on her terms too. And it took me a long time to come to that belief, but that's one of the things her death did teach me. And but I carry that guilt for a long time, and I think a lot of men that I've talked to carry that, in terms of geez, I should have done more. I mean, I'm the protector of the family. I should have done more to protect my kids from her. But the bottom line is she had a disease that was incurable, and given the hand of cards that was dealt, I think myself and our family did as well as we could under the circumstances. And that's the conclusion I've come to today.
Yeah, right. And it's funny because we often hear women saying that they feel guilt when they lose a child, but men don't often talk about it, do they?
No, we basically, I think we kind of distract ourselves from our grief, and we try to do things.
Yeah.
We try to get busy,
Yeah.
but I believe that men and women experience feelings that has intent, but we just deal with it differently. As men, we deal with it differently. We distract ourselves from those feelings, and we just try to get busy,
Yep.
and get into other stuff. But we still hurt.
Yep.
We still hurt.
Absolutely. What I found in my research over the years is people's greatest fear when they do lose a child is the fear of moving forward and they'll forget their child. What advice would you give to those harbouring that kind of a fear? Because I know you'll never forget Janine.
No, and and you'll never forget Holly either, Cal.
Exactly. Yep.
And one of the things I live by is that forgetting is not a requirement of our grief journey, but remembering and staying connected to our children is. So that's the first amount of advice I would give to anybody, is you grieve through remembering, not by forgetting. And I think what I believe the fear of forgetting is due in many ways to a society that has reinforced, and particularly Western society, that has reinforced that there's a time limit on our grieving, that after a certain period of time we should move on, forget those loved ones, and that everything returns back to normal. But guess what? Anytime we experience a loss of any kind, our world is forever changed. And the more we can acknowledge that and in some ways embrace that, the more we're going to be able to. But it's about remembering and staying connected, and that's the advice that I would give anybody.
Yep.
Anybody ever wants to call me or Skype me and they want to talk about their child or anybody, I'll listen to them all day. I don't care if it's been a year, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years.
Yeah.
That's what it's all about, remembering and staying connected and celebrating the stories of our loved ones.
Absolutely.
And the lives of our.
Yep. Beautifully said, Dave. Now, there are people around the world at the moment who are going through what you went through and what you're still going through. What advice would you give to them, Dave?
I think basically the same thing. There's a couple of things that have helped me. One is I just had blind faith in the earliest steps of my grief and the earliest pain. I just kept moving with the hope that there would be a ray of light. I didn't know what I was moving towards, but I just kept moving. And I availed myself of support, and that's the biggest thing. Reach out for support. Go to a bereaved parents support group, either through the Compassionate Friends or the Bereaved Parents of the USA, or if there's a private organization that sponsors that. Find support that is where you can be with people who understand what it is you need to do. There is no time frame in terms of doing this. You can do it just whenever you are ready. And I tell people progress made is never ever progress lost. So celebrate the progress that you make every day. You journal about it, talk about it to a friend, to your support group, talk to your child about it. But celebrate the small steps that you make every day. And just realize that our grief journeys are marathons and they're not sprints. And along the way, be gentle to yourself, celebrate what you can do, and don't worry about what you can't do, because eventually the things you can't do early on in the grief journey, as long as you keep working and you have faith and you avail yourself of support, you'll be able to do it later on. So be gentle with yourself along the way as well.
Yep, terrific. A lot of people also get stuck in their grief, Dave, and they find it really hard to move forward. What's the one thing do you think that actually stopped you from becoming stuck in that dark place?
I think it was a process for me, but I think the biggest thing was I gradually changed my perspective on life and death. I had to look at Janine's death differently. I had to look at it, from a perspective of, the fact that I had a choice. I could have either been buried in my pain and done nothing, or tried to, as a result of my struggle with her death, try to find meaning and help others in their own grief. And it's basically, changing the perspective for me in terms of looking at it differently and deciding, okay, how do I want to progress as a result of my struggle with her death? And I think that was the biggest thing. And I had a lot of help and support, along the way with that too. There was a lot of people that helped me get through that. And for a while, I didn't want to get through that. I did not want to break through to the other side. I just wanted to stay stuck in pain, and I just don't want to move. But I realized long term that it was not going to do any good for me. That I needed to make a decision to celebrate Janine's life while renewing mine. And it was all about a gradual shift in perspective about death, about relationships, about everything.
Yep.
But it took a long time.
Absolutely, yeah. It's funny how we sort of get stuck there, and we just either can't or don't want to move forward. And I use the analogy of a flower that's dead and a flower that's alive. Mm-hmm. What's the difference there? A flower that's alive is growing and moving, and if you don't keep moving, even really slowly, then eventually you'll just sort of die yourself inside, and which is a really bad place to be. So that's a great way you've explained that. So excellent.
Well, thank you. And the other thing is, I had people along the way that did not let me sink. I had so many people that just, for whatever reason, whether it was the spirit guides that did this, I had people every step of my journey. When I wanted to take a step backwards, they wouldn't let me. And I think it was Janine's way of saying, look, Dad, I'm going to be with you. We're going to get through this. I'm not going to let you struggle. And every time I met other people who inspired me, it gave me just another ray of hope and gave me another reason to move another step forward. So,
yeah. And so one thing that's really coming through by talking to you is, for people who are listening, is to really, if you are stuck, seek support, speak to people.
Yes.
Yes.
Seek support, speak to people. If there's also online support too. You can go to the Passion and Friends National website, and you can find virtual support. There's social network page, Kevin. You know this with Facebook. There are so many pages.
Yeah.
But your page, other pages on grief and inspiration, and other pages that allow individuals to post 24/7. So there's a variety of ways to get support. It's just a matter. You just do a little bit each day. It's like exercise. Doing 10 minutes of exercise a day is better than doing no minutes of exercise a day. Yeah. So you reach out for support as you feel emotionally able to do it, and as you have the energy to do it, and just keep working at it.
Absolutely. You're listening to an interview between Kevin McNamara and David Roberts for Grief to Inspiration, people that inspire.
The other thing, Kevin, if I could backtrack for a second, just real quickly. There's one other thing that really, I think, a turning point that you'd asked me about that I forgot to mention, is being stuck in my grief. Yep. In addition to support, very quickly, my youngest son, Matthew, graduated from high school in 2006, and this was about 3 years after Janine had crossed over. And during his graduation ceremony, we heard the song by Leanne Womack called I Hope You Dance, which was Janine's tribute song at her funeral. And in the midst of my sadness, and I at that time I felt sad every time I heard that song, I had a brief vision of Janine as a child, and she was smiling and she was dancing under a blue sky, and I saw this vividly. And I interpreted this vision to mean that Janine was going to be okay, and that our family and myself were going to be okay in the aftermath of the worst loss that we'd ever experienced. And at that moment, I knew that there was promise of a future for me without the physical presence of Janine. So I just wanted to mention that because I had forgotten to earlier. So
No, that's great. That's beautiful, actually. That's fantastic. That real moment where you just know this person's going to be with you anyway. That's great.
yep, and that's when I knew. I said I knew it. It was reinforced for me then that I was gonna make it. That I was gonna get through this with her help. So
Yep, fantastic. Okay, Dave, so what was the real the turning point for you when you decided that you wanted to work with other people and with grief, and you started your website? What was the real turning point there for you?
well, I had started for me. It was a conversation that I had with Carla Blowy. It had to be about 5 years ago, and at the time she was the editor for the Living with Loss magazine. And Carla lives in Colorado. And we had talked and we immediately hit it off. Carla's a bereaved parent herself, and she's a certified dream facilitator as well too. And she asked me to write an article for her magazine, and she eventually recommended me to the chairperson of the National Conference for the Compassionate Friends in Nashville to do a workshop. And then from there, it just skyrocketed. And Carla said, you know, Dave, you ought to get a website. You know, you're going to be doing some national conferences. You ought to get a website. So I had established Bootsy and Angel Books. But basically, it was a resource to provide hope, support, you know, for individuals who are grieving. And Bootsy and Angel is named after Janine's two cats, by the way. So they are the head of the corporation. So they pretty much call the shots for me. If you wanted me to mention the website, I mean, you can find me at www.bootsyandangel.com. So, my email address is listed there as well. So, if anybody wants to check out the site or even just contact me, I'll be glad to talk to anybody. So, and since that time, it's just skyrocketed. I've done workshops for the Compassionate Friends and the Bereaved Parents of the USA, and had the privilege of being the opening keynote speaker at the National Gathering of the Bereaved Parents of the USA in Reston, Virginia last year. So Carla was the one that got me started. It was basically a very one of those meetings that that happened when I was focusing on something else. She was one of the other individuals that came into my life, and I believe spirit guided her to me at that point. So
absolutely. Okay, so who are the role models or the mentors that have really inspired you, and what lessons have you learned from people?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, it goes to my mother, Kev. My mother is probably the most beautiful person, inside and out, that you could ever find. She taught me the difference between right and wrong. She instilled a tremendous moral fiber in me. She taught me how to treat people with respect. Everything I have accomplished is because of my mother. I mean, because of her influence. She modeled resiliency, toughness. She had some tough circumstances to overcome all of her life, but she did it with grace. And they talk about grace under pressure. She exemplified that. And finally, I think my mentor and former supervisor, a guy by the name of Don, who was a social worker, who was a tremendous administrator as well as a clinician, and that's in our area, it's a very difficult combination to find. He taught me how to motivate people, how to supervise people. He taught me how to work very constructively with a very difficult population. He was also like a father figure to me. He was like the father figure that I never had. And unfortunately, Don died in 1998 as a result of cancer himself. And he was very close to our family, very close to my daughter in particular. And he helped my daughter through some I call the wilderness phase of her teenage years. And so those two are probably the biggest influences in my life. And I've met some tremendous people along the way, who have also inspired me. But these are the two that are probably my biggest influences, and whose lessons I continue to teach in others. So.
Yep, great, fantastic. Now we all go through sort of down times and stuff, Dave. Were there any times that you really wanted to just give up in life? And if so, what got you through those periods?
Kevin, when I saw that question, I really had to think about it because I don't think there was ever a time that I ever wanted to give up in life, but there was plenty of times I got discouraged. Whether it be because I got overlooked for a job promotion that I thought I should have had, which, as it now pales in comparison to anything else I've experienced in my life. But never did I feel more discouraged than I was early in my grief with Janine, and I never thought I'd experience joy again. I think, again, what helped me, again, was the support from others and blind faith that if I kept working and I didn't know how, that things were somehow I was going to see a light at the end of the tunnel. But again, I go back to the support, and I go back to just my determination in terms of not wanting to be stuck in pain the rest of my life. I didn't want to live that kind of existence.
Yeah, sure. What's one of the biggest mistakes you've ever made in your life, Dave, and what did you learn from it?
That was another question that challenged me because
I'm sure you've only made one or two.
I tried to think of the biggest mistake, and Kevin, I've made a lot of them. I've made a lot of mistakes. And I don't know if I could just point to one as a big mistake, as the biggest mistake I've made, because I've made plenty of them. But fortunately, I think I've learned from them all. But I think one of the biggest mistakes I ever made was involved when I was a supervisor. And this was early in my career. And I attempted to apply the same solutions to a system that had changed drastically. And I wasn't flexible in my approach to realize that the system had changed. And in the process, I caused a lot of undue stress on my staff. And I mean, a lot of undue stress. And what I learned from that, and they sat down with me and they told me, hey, here's what we see that you are doing, here's what we see that you're not doing. What I learned was to listen to their input and have them work with me to solve the problem. There's a saying that your staff are your greatest asset, and I think it's true, but it's your well-trained staff that are your greatest asset. And I realized at that point that I could learn more by listening than I ever could by talking. So I learned to listen and be responsive to the needs of my staff, and that also translated to the work that I do with clients. So, that was also a turning point for me, as well as one of the biggest mistakes that I ever made. So, was my inflexible thinking in a system that had changed.
And a great lesson for everyone to listen.
I get more from people's stories, and I get that by listening and being a companion with their pain, and just trying to get an understanding of who they lost through their eyes, and just letting them lead me wherever they want. The journey's going to take me, and I tell them that. I mean, you're driving the bus. You're going to lead me. You're not going to lead me where you don't want to take me. So I'm just going to go along for the ride and be as supportive as I can, given the path that you've charted for me. So
beautiful. What's the most important piece of advice anyone's ever given you?
And again, in addition to the daily wisdom that my mother imparted on me, God rest her soul, my mentor and supervisor, Don, when we were discussing the art of decision making, and he said something to me that I'll never forget. He always told me that any decision you make is sound as long as it was made in a way that was consistent with your values and your beliefs, and it was ethical. I never forgot that advice, because a lot of times people will question the decisions that we make, and it's just part of human nature that people are going to second guess whatever decision you make. But he taught me, he said, don't focus on the second guessing, focus on the process, focus on the ethics of your decision making, the consistency with your beliefs and values. And he said people are going to follow you based on what you do, and not really what you really that was a bit of advice that I'll never forget.
Yeah, wow, great advice. Gee. Is there a significant?
Yeah, I'll tell you.
Sorry, go on.
I just said, yeah, he was one of a kind. He was extremely brilliant and just a great guy, irreplaceable.
Dave, have you got a significant quote or a saying that you live your life by?
Yeah, it's funny. The quotes that I've lived my life by have kind of changed depending on where I'm at in the journey. But this one quote for me has really, I think, really something I've lived by and will continue to live by. And this is a quote from Jamie Sams. She is a Native American teacher who has written a book very simply called Medicine Cards. And she has done a lot of work along with Ted Andrews in terms of Native American animal medicine, in terms of the medicine or the teachings that animals have and will impart on you. And I have been lately, Kev, I've been really getting tuned a lot into different animal energies and noting an animal that walks in my path and what it means. And particularly, one of the animals that has been very significant in my life has been crow. And crow is very simply about honoring the past, present, and future. And this is how Sam sums up the quote about crow medicine. Honor the past as your teacher, honor the present as your creation, and honor the future as your inspiration. And that's something that I know I will be living by. Wow. And crow is also, in Native American culture, the significance of crow is also about if you have faith, any obstacles will be removed from your path. And so that's another thing that crow has taught me, is to have faith and keep my focus on the present, and everything will take care of itself. So I've embraced a lot of non-ordinary phenomenon in my journey. It's something that has helped me. And it's not for everybody, but I tell individuals, whatever is going to help you adjust to a world without the physical presence of our children, as long as it isn't illegal and isn't going to involve you getting arrested, do that. So, do that. So,
well, I'd love that quote. That's fantastic. I really, and I think it's important to be open to things too when you're in this situation where you are grieving, is to be sort of open to different spiritual teachings and that kind of thing, because we're all different and different things help different people, and you've certainly proved that.
Well, and the other thing too, Kev, the rules changed drastically when Janine died for me. I mean, conventional law, human law probably didn't even apply anymore. It was more in terms of sacred and spiritual law that I've been tuning into, because I couldn't operate under the same set of rules and assumptions and have gotten to the point that I've gotten in my life. That had to change, and in doing that, I had to embrace some different teachings. So
you've done well, fantastic, and it works. Definitely, that finding that that non-physical experience out there is it just opens your eyes, and really, once you start getting that, I think that's the start of finding some peace too. I think you'd agree.
Yes, and I think it is. I think it is, because there's a lot of comfort in spiritual messages and non-ordinary phenomena if you're open to it, if you walk in awareness and embrace it when it happens, and I believe that we can all find peace in that.
Yep, for sure. What do you think holds people back from achieving peace, for example, and achieving their goals? What do you think really holds them back?
Well, I think for me the biggest thing, Kev, is their fear of empowering themselves to look at a problem from a totally different perspective other than the status quo. The status quo doesn't apply in a lot of situations anymore. In order for me to have adjusted to a world without the physical presence of Janine, I had to reject the time-limited perspectives and grief, and I had to embrace a perspective that allowed me to stay connected to Janine. There were no time limits, and embody her best qualities into my own life. So it was, empowering myself to look at her crossing over from a totally different perspective, and also, is a quote I heard from, I heard is death ends a life, not a relationship, and that was from Maury Schwartz, who was the subject of a Mitch Albom book, Tuesdays with Maury, and so death ends a life, not a relationship.
I think in some ways you've already answered the next question, which is what advice would you give to someone on how to overcome their fear and have more confidence?
Well, I got a couple things to add to that, and I can. First is to understand that fear is a part of life, that it can be an asset in helping you achieve your goals. If you use your fear constructively, and you use it as kind of an attention getter, and use it to impress upon you the importance of any task. You look at athletes, Kev, every day. A lot of athletes, the great athletes, still have butterflies before big games. They still have kind of that fear of failure, and that motivates them to do better and to do well. So embrace it without being smothered by it. Ask yourself, what's the worst possible thing that can happen if you don't achieve your goal? Now, usually the worst thing that can happen is death. and no one has ever died from failure. At least to my knowledge, that hasn't been a certified cause of death.
Yes.
Know your limitations and have a plan to address them. If you fear public speaking, take a public speaking course. We all have limitations, and we need to celebrate what we can do and what we can't do. But we are obligated, I believe, professionally and personally, to understand what our limitations are and to try to address those, in the best possible way that we can. So that's the advice that I could give in terms of that for fear holding somebody back. So.
And great advice too. And finally, Dave, you've been through the pain and heartache of losing a child, and now you are someone who really does inspire others. So who or what inspires Dave Roberts?
Well, obviously, as I mentioned, Kev, my daughter always inspires me.
Absolutely.
She's the greatest teacher I know, and we are partners in grief. Well, the thing that inspires me the most are people like yourself, other people along the way. I've always been inspired by their stories, and the journeys of other bereaved parents who have blessed me with their presence. I consider it the greatest gift in the world to be a companion to somebody's intimate story of their life and death with a child, with someone who is significant in their lives. And because of their presence, for however long it may be in my life, I've become more fulfilled in the aftermath of the worst experience of my life, and in a world that will never be the same. And for that kind of support, Kevin, for that kind of validation, for that kind of companionship, I'll be forever grateful, in spite of what's happened to me and my family. Overall, I can say today I'm blessed.
Fantastic. Listen, Dave, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, Kevin, thanks for having me, and it was a pleasure. I hope we can do this again sometime.
Oh, look, you've really inspired me, and look, I admire you so much for what you do, and for helping people going through the grieving process. And I really wish you continued success on your journey, and I hope we can talk again very soon, Dave.
I hope we can too, Kevin. Thanks so much, and bless you for the great work you're doing for the bereaved as well too.
Thanks a lot, Dave.
Thank you, Kevin.